Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's program entitled America's Changing National Security Environment, Challenges from Russia and China, presented by Ms. Madelyn Creedon right here in your upper right-hand corner. And you will see her plenty over the next hour. I'm Jim Van Epps, the president of the Savannah Council, and we're glad to have you here this evening, especially as we transition from our several-year home on the landings down here. And we believe this is the future home and will be the home of the Savannah Council on World Affairs, particularly given what we expect is going to be, because of reasons you've all read about, the expansion or the explosion of business in the Savannah area. And we believe it will come to the west and to the north from here. So this seemed to be a more central location for people who will, we think, come to our program. To begin, our sponsor for tonight's program is Kreitz Auto Group. You're familiar, they're a longtime sponsor, providing automotive excellence in Savannah and the Coastal Empire for over 80 years. They're a continuing platinum sponsor, and we're very grateful for that. Our exclusive dealer for Buick, GMC, BMW, Mercedes, and Sprinter vans, and we're very grateful. Thank you, Kreitz. Also, this program is sponsored by Planters Inn. There isn't another hotel in Savannah that offers the elegant amenities, elegantly appointed rooms, and historic location that you'll find at Planters Inn. So thank you, Planters Inn. And we're also fortunate to be sponsored by Reach the World. You might not be that familiar because they haven't been that long of a sponsor, a long time for us, but for over 20 years they've harnessed the power of virtual exchange, bringing the world into classroom. Each school year, Reach the World offers opportunities for teachers, students, and their families to connect with travelers exploring the globe in real time. And we're appreciative of their sponsorship tonight. One last word on that. We very much appreciate our sponsors, and we welcome any and all members to become corporate or individual sponsors to assist us in our goal of enhancing interest in international affairs, as well as providing scholarships to students traveling and studying abroad. So, our speaker, Madelyn Creedon, has had a long career in U.S. government service. Most recently, as a principal deputy administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration within the Department of Energy. She served in the Pentagon as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs from 2011 to 2014, overseeing policy developments in the areas of missile defense, nuclear security, cybersecurity, and space. She served as counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Armed Forces for many years, beginning in 1990. Assignments and focus areas included the Subcommittee on Strategic Forces, as well as Threat Reduction and Nuclear Non-Proliferation. During that time, she also served as Deputy Administrator for Defense Programs at the National Nuclear Security Agency, Associate Deputy Secretary of Energy, and General Counsel for the Defense Base Closure and Realignment Commission, or BRAC. She started her career as a trial attorney at the Department of Energy. Following retirement from federal service in 2017, Ms. Creedon established Green Marble Group, a consulting company, and currently serves on several advisory boards related to national security. She's also a research professor at the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs and a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. She holds a Juris Doctor from St. Louis University School of Law and a Bachelor's University from the University of Evansville. And as I recall, they played great football down there. And her topic is U.S. national security in jeopardy as Russia and challenge both U.S. global leadership and the role of deterrence in preventing conflicts around the world. You'll hear Madelyn's views on these challenges as a member of the U.S. Congress's bipartisan U.S. Strategic Posture Commission that concluded last year, that we face unprecedented threats from authoritarian regimes that are building up their military forces and behaving aggressively towards their neighbors. The Commission cited the Chinese program to add, for instance, 1,000 strategic nuclear weapons to their arsenal. Russian behavior in Ukraine and mutual support between Russia and China is the most progressing challenges. How should the next U.S. administration address these threats and concerns? And what does this mean for the U.S. nuclear posture, for our alliances, and for defense spending? For a presentation on these issues, followed by a Q&A period, let's welcome the former Deputy Principal Administrator of the National Nuclear Security Administration, former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Global Strategic Affairs, and the current Senior Fellow at the Brookings Administration, the Honorable Madelyn Creedon. You're welcome. You know about this, right? Okay, good.
Okay. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully this is working. And it truly is great to be back in Savannah. I've had the pleasure over the years to join my friends Karen and Jerry Stoltz at the book festival, and it's always a pleasure. So it's nice to be back here. And thank you, Jim, for the kind introduction. I have had a very interesting background, and it is. I've learned a lot from it, and it's taken me all over the world. But today, I want to really talk a little bit about deterrence and the state of global affairs today, and then also the report. And I think somewhere out there are a few copies of the report. That we brought. We released this report back in October, and it's really very interesting, and in many respects it's quite a sobering report. But before we get there, I wanted to just go into a bit of history to set the stage for what I'm actually going to talk about today. And at the end of the Cold War, it became clear that the U.S. and the former Soviet Union didn't need all of the nuclear weapons that existed at the time. So on this chart, that gray peak up at the top, that's the total inventory of nuclear weapons that happened in the mid-'80s. The orange-ish peak is Russia, and the blue line is the United States. So between this gray peak there at the top, the world peaked at about 70,000 nuclear weapons, which is really staggering when you think about it. And over time, as you see, these reductions started to happen. But the reductions were put in place by a series of agreements and treaties. The last of which, and the one that's currently in effect, is a treaty called the New START Treaty. START being the Strategic Arms Reductions Treaty. And currently, down there on the right, you see that each side has about 4,000 active nuclear weapons. Now, all those little colorful boxes on the right, that's just a list of all the other countries that have nuclear weapons, and you probably can't see it, but their nuclear weapons, other than Russia and the US, over time were so small that they're actually buried in that little line on the bottom. So between the US and the Soviet Union and then Russia, about 92% of the world's nuclear weapons were held by the US and Russia. When the Soviet Union dissolved in December of 1991, 3 of the newly independent countries, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Belarus, were left with Soviet nuclear weapons and delivery systems. And these delivery systems and weapons had been deployed by the Soviet Union in all 3 countries. And basically overnight, when the former Soviet Union collapsed, these 3 countries became the 3rd, 4th, and 5th largest nuclear weapon states in the world after Russia and the US. So the question is, well, what happened to these countries? What happened to the weapons in Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan? Shortly after the 5-day coup that had been attempted in Russia, then as the Soviet Union is collapsing, in 1991, Senator Sam Nunn, the former senator from Georgia, and then the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee and my boss at the time, began to worry about the security of these nuclear weapons. And so he traveled to Moscow, and he met with President Gorbachev. And he wanted to know if Gorbachev had maintained control of the nuclear weapons during that 5-day coup. And Senator Nunn had met with Gorbachev on several previous occasions. And although Gorbachev assured him that the weapons were secure, Senator Nunn wasn't convinced and thought that maybe Gorbachev was just telling him this because this is what Senator Nunn wanted to hear. And so as a result of this concern, when Senator Nunn got back to Washington, he recruited another senator, Dick Lugar from Indiana, and the two of them established what became known as the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, or CTR, to secure and dismantle nuclear weapons, secure nuclear weapons materials, so highly enriched uranium and plutonium, and to return the nuclear weapons in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine to Russia, and dismantle the nuclear delivery systems left behind in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine. In other words, the bombers and the intercontinental ballistic missiles. By the end of 2012, under the auspices of this Nunn-Lugar Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, and with the close cooperation and support of Russia, as well as the three countries, all the nuclear weapons in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus had been returned to Russia. And the US had destroyed all of the ICBMs in those three countries and some of the Soviet bombers that had been left behind. And all three nations joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. CTR also destroyed nuclear-capable ICBMs in Russia, as well as nuclear-armed submarines. The CTR program also helped Kazakhstan clean up and close the Soviet nuclear weapons test site at Semipalatinsk. And this slide is we call it the scorecard for the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. And it shows all of the various accomplishments of the program over the years. So in addition to repatriating the nuclear weapons left behind in Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Ukraine to Russia, the CTR program also helped many of the states of the former Soviet Union identify and destroy the chemical weapons and the biological weapons infrastructure that the Soviet Union had left behind in these states. The US also helped Russia destroy chemical weapons and secure some of the former biological weapons facilities, converting them to peaceful uses. And the US also helped to increase security at plutonium and uranium storage sites. So the question is, at least some of the questions that we see today are, so why did these three countries agree to give up their nuclear weapons? Why did Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus agree to become non-nuclear weapon states? So each country certainly had their own reasons, but in the end, they all agreed to give up their nuclear weapons and join the International Non-Proliferation Treaty as non-nuclear weapon states. For Ukraine, the basis of their decision was the 1994 Budapest Memorandum. So shortly after the CTR work had started, Russia, the US, and the United Kingdom signed an agreement with Ukraine, the Budapest Memorandum, which provided security assurances to Ukraine in exchange for the agreement that Ukraine had made to give up the nuclear weapons. The memorandum prohibited Russia, the US, and the UK from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine and its territorial integrity, except in self-defense or otherwise in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations. And it committed the three countries to respect the existing borders of Ukraine. So as a result of the agreement, the Budapest Memorandum, and the security assurances it contained, Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons and the nuclear delivery systems. And similar agreements were signed for Kazakhstan and for Belarus. But I want to get back to the various treaties that I mentioned earlier that reduced nuclear weapons in the US and Russia. So you probably can't read the slide, and that's not really the intent. But what I was wanting to show here is the fact that over time, there were many, many treaties, and that the Soviet Union and then Russia have a long history of entering into bilateral arms control treaties to reduce the size of their respective nuclear arsenals. So in the early days of the Cold War, many of these treaties covered nuclear weapons testing as well. Once one of them, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which had been signed by President Reagan in 1987, banned an entire class of ballistic missiles. These were intermediate range missiles that had ranges between 300 and 3,500 miles. But most of the treaties focused on reducing nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty 1, or START 1, had been signed in July of 1991, just before the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And it entered into force in 1994, with Russia as the successor to the former Soviet Union. The treaty limited strategic nuclear delivery systems to 1,600 delivery vehicles per country, and has set a ceiling of 6,000 nuclear weapons deployed on the delivery vehicles. A follow-on treaty, the START II treaty, was signed by Presidents Bush and Yeltsin in 1993. Now, it would have required further reductions in delivery systems by December of 2002. Although both the US and Russia ratified the treaty, Russia pulled out in 2002, the day after the US withdrew from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Ironically, both sides were at the time pretty much in compliance with the central limits of the START II treaty. The START I treaty, the one that was still in force, however, was going to expire in December of 2009. And when that happened, there would be no limits on strategic nuclear weapons. So each side agreed to observe the terms of the treaty until a new treaty was in place. And the follow-on treaty, the new START treaty, was quickly negotiated and signed in April of 2010 by Presidents Obama and Medvedev. And it entered into force in February of 2011. So that treaty, the new START treaty, is still in force, but it expires in February of 2026. This treaty limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads to 1,550, with 700 deployed strategic delivery systems. Because of the US assistance to Ukraine, Russia has now suspended its compliance activities, inspections and whatnot, under the treaty, but at the moment we think Russia remains in compliance with the treaty. So before I go on, I also want to be clear, so what exactly is a strategic nuclear warhead and a strategic nuclear system? So this chart is a bar graph of the two arsenals, and also shows in a little bit better fashion some of the arsenals of the other countries that possess nuclear weapons. So the taller one, the taller bar on the left, that's Russia. The gray area on the top are the warheads that are basically retired. They're just waiting to be dismantled. The blue ones are the ones that are in reserve, and the orange ones are the ones that are actually deployed. Now, you note this chart talks about strategic nuclear systems. And I don't know if you can see it, but there's a tiny, tiny little line on the US chart that's just a shade paler orange. Those are non-strategic weapons. So most of the US stockpile has these strategic weapons. Okay, so what's a strategic weapon? So in the US and in Russia, strategic weapons are nuclear weapons that tend to have much longer ranges. So these are the US ones. So over there on the left, that's ICBM that's run by they're managed by the Air Force. And they have two different types of nuclear warheads, and those are shown on the left. Beneath that is the B-52 bomber. It's one of two bombers the US has. One is the B-52 and the other is the B-2. And the B-2 is getting ready to retire, and it'll be replaced with the B-21. And then I'm going to jump up to the right hand, and that's a ballistic missile that's launched from a Navy submarine. And at the moment, the Navy submarines are the Columbia-class ballistic missile submarines, and they carry these two warheads, the W-76 and the W-88. Now, down in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a picture of an F-15, and eventually it will be joined by the F-35. And this is the U.S. non-strategic capability. It's these fighters with this B-61. Now the map in the middle shows where these systems are stationed in the U.S. The blue boxes are all of the bases where these various systems are stationed. I should point out that at least that one of the two submarine bases is actually in Kings Bay, Florida, which is, Kings Bay, Georgia, which is just above Jacksonville, Florida. So the green boxes are the sites for the National Nuclear Security Administration, where I used to work. So the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA, not to be confused with NASA, which happens all the time. No, we do not send astronauts anywhere. But the NNSA is the organization that's the successor to the Manhattan Project. So if you've seen Oppenheimer movie, well, eventually the Manhattan Project became the National Nuclear Security Administration. And its job, among other things, is to maintain the warheads. And so the green sites are all the different NNSA sites where the warheads are assembled, the materials are stored, parts are made, and the laboratories that work on these various systems. But there's one more treaty that's also relevant to this discussion, and that's the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. So I mentioned before that many of the treaties with the Soviet Union and Russia were treaties having to do with nuclear weapons testing. Among other things, these older treaties banned atmospheric testing and limited the size of nuclear test explosions underground. Finally, in 1996, a multilateral treaty banning all explosive nuclear testing, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, was negotiated and open for signature. After the Cold War ended and the reductions in the nuclear arsenal really started, the treaty was the next logical step in reducing nuclear dangers. Unfortunately, the CTBT has not yet entered into force. Although 178 nations have signed and ratified the CTBT, India, Pakistan, and North Korea have not signed. China, Egypt, Iran, Israel, and the US have signed but haven't ratified the treaty. And Russia signed and ratified the treaty, but after the invasion of Ukraine, and because of the US support to Ukraine, it withdrew its ratification, but it remains a signatory. But even before signing the CTBT, the US had adopted a moratorium on nuclear weapons testing. And with the moratorium in place, it embarked on an extensive program of scientific experiments and computational capabilities to replicate most of the technical information that had been gathered through explosive nuclear testing. And today, with this program called the Science-Based Stockpiled Stewardship Program, and the data from the over 1,000 nuclear weapons tests that the US conducted before the moratorium, the National Nuclear Security Administration now knows more about how nuclear weapons work and how they age than was known during the years of testing. So there's absolutely no need to return to testing, and the NNSA has been able to maintain the warheads safely and securely without testing. So with this knowledge, as I said, the NNSA has been able to extend the life of the nuclear weapons by rebuilding them and replacing obsolete parts and materials. A few of them were so old they even had vacuum tubes. And I say this to some younger audiences that I talk to, and they have not a clue what a vacuum tube is. So the program of modernization that's ongoing right now for the warheads is shown in this chart. The delivery systems are also really old, and when the New START Treaty was signed, the US began to not only extend the life of the warheads, but also to replace the delivery systems. So a new submarine, a new bomber, and a new ICBM. The size of the nuclear arsenal and the delivery systems are all still governed by the limits under the New START Treaty. In 2010, when the New START Treaty was signed, Russia was not exactly a friend, but it wasn't an enemy either. And the US thought that there was an opportunity to reduce tensions and create a partnership with Russia. And when New START was signed, it was supposed to be just the first step in further additional mutual nuclear reductions. And at the time, China had a very small nuclear arsenal, about 300 to 400 weapons, and was not seen as a military threat to the US or to its regional allies. But fast forward to today, the world has changed rapidly and dramatically. The US is confronted with a new and unsettled political situation, one we didn't want, and one that we are simply not prepared for. So today, these are now states in the world that the US is worried about, and Congress was also worried about this situation. And so in 2022, in the National Defense Authorization Act, Congress determined it was time for a serious look at the strategic posture of the United States. And as a result, they established the Strategic Posture Commission as a congressional commission. So we were 12 commissioners. 6 were appointed by Democratic members of the Congress and 6 by Republican members. Our collective service included positions in the Department of Defense, State, Treasury, Energy. In Congress as members, my vice chair was former Senator John Kyle from Arizona, as well as staff, the White House, US Strategic Command, the Joint Staff, NATO, think tanks, and academia. So amongst the 12 of us, we covered a wide range of backgrounds. The members were appointed in June of 2022, and we began our work in July. We released our final report and its findings and recommendations in October of 2023, just a little over a year ago. It's certainly fair to say that these 12 members had very different views on the topics before us. And when we started off on this commission, I pretty much had no hope that we would ever reach consensus. Our views were so disparate. But in the end, we did. We ended up with a consensus report, and we think it's a very strong and eye-opening report. So we were asked to examine and make recommendations to the President and Congress with respect to the long-term strategic posture of the United States. The Commission was asked to do 3 things. We were asked to conduct a review of the strategic posture of the United States, including a strategic threat assessment and a detailed review of nuclear weapons policy, strategy, and force structure. We were asked to assess the benefits associated with the current strategic posture and nuclear policies of the United States, factors affecting strategic stability that relate to strategic posture, and lessons learned from the previous Strategic Posture Commission. There had been one in 2009, as well as previous nuclear posture reviews and other national security documents. And finally, we were asked to make recommendations with respect to the most appropriate strategic posture, the extent to which capabilities other than nuclear weapons can contribute to or detract from strategic stability, and the most effective nuclear weapons strategy for strategic force posture and stability. We were also asked to look at 9 specific topics, since it wasn't all about nuclear deterrence and nuclear systems, in our final report, and that included military capabilities writ large, and the force structure, as well as the nuclear force structure, nuclear and non-nuclear, kinetic and non-kinetic capabilities, nuclear infrastructure, missile defense, cyber, space, non-proliferation, nuclear arms control, our relationship with our allies, and anything else relating to strategy. We had a lot. Congress was particularly, so you get an idea of why I never thought we were going to get to a report. Congress was particularly concerned about new peer competitors of the United States and peer and near-peer nuclear power competition. So as a result, we looked primarily at Russia and China, but we also looked at North Korea and Iran, because we recognized that while Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, obviously North Korea does, but both North Korea and Iran can affect strategic stability. And we're certainly seeing that now in both of these countries' direct support to Russia and Ukraine, including Iran's decision to supply armed drones and ballistic missiles to Russia, and North Korea's provision of troops, ammunition, and short-range ballistic missiles. Once organized, we set about defining some terms that Congress had not defined in our organizing statute. So they didn't define long-term strategy, they didn't define strategic posture, and they didn't define strategic stability. So we had to do it ourselves. So we started, and we said, okay, so for our purposes, long term is going to be from 2027 to 2035, because we didn't want to look at or judge the current or previous administrations. We really wanted to be a forward-looking body. And we agreed that strategy is going to be a method by which the United States develops and employs the instruments of national power to achieve national objectives. So not just military power, but the whole range of soft power, economics, diplomatic, across the board. And then we define strategic posture as the way the United States is positioned to defend itself and its allies and advance American interests. Strategic posture draws on the capacity, the capability, the flexibility, and the resolve that the United States has developed across all of these tools of national power, and encompasses the forces and their supporting infrastructure and industrial base. And lastly, we considered strategic stability broadly as a condition in which the political relations and military balance between states that pose an existential threat to each other is such that they perceive neither a compelling need nor a viable opportunity to use military force to advance their interests at the expense of the other state. So to get started with our work, the Commission met with folks from DoD, the State Department, the National Nuclear Security Administration, the intelligence community, academics, think tanks. We met with a lot of our NATO allies, as well as allies in the Asia-Pacific region. We met with ambassadors and other representatives from a wide variety of not only allies, but also writers and thinkers in the US. And these discussions were both classified and unclassified, but they gave us a deep understanding of what Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran were doing and why. So some key takeaways from those discussions were the rate at which China has embarked on a nuclear weapons development program. So China is rapidly expanding its nuclear and conventional capabilities, and it hopes to have a nuclear force structure on par with the US by the 2030s. Right now, they actually have more ICBM silos under construction than the US has. They have developed a new nuclear triad, and as I mentioned, have more ICBMs than the US. They're also developing a number of systems such as this hypersonic glide vehicle, and the other short-range and medium-range missiles there on the left that probably also carry both nuclear as well as conventional systems. Russia, too, has been increasing its reliance on its nuclear arsenal, and it's also been expanding the size of its non-strategic arsenal. So remember, all of our various treaties are strategic arms reduction treaties, but there are this other class of treaties, these non-strategic treaties, or non-strategic nuclear weapons, which for the most part tend to be shorter range, and these are not covered by treaties. And so there are no constraints on these development of the non-strategic warheads. And although we don't know how many of these non-strategic warheads Russia has, we think they probably have into thousands. They're also developing some very strange weapons. And so the one up there in the right-hand corner, this thing called the Poseidon, it's basically, you think of it as like a really big torpedo, but it's nuclear powered, and it's also armed with nuclear weapons. So it can be launched autonomously and then just swim in the ocean for a very long time. It's also very hard to detect it. And the new partnership between Russia and China, the Treaty of Friendship Without Limitations, poses new threats, including the possibility of opportunistic aggression or even cooperative actions in two theaters. So North Korea has also been busy. It has a variety of missiles that it's developing, and it still maintains an underground test site. Although it hasn't tested in about 5 years, periodically it talks about resuming underground testing. And remember, it's never signed the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, but they have an extensive centrifuge research and development program. Those are just pictures of some centrifuges. And we know that their program for enriching uranium has been going on for years, and that they're very close to having sufficient capability to be able to produce a nuclear weapon on very short notice. So let's drill down on a few of the findings and recommendations that we had in the report. We had 80, I'm not going to go through them all, but I did want to highlight a few. So we found that due to China's buildup, that the United States can no longer treat China as what we used to call a lesser included case. So I said earlier that when the New START treaty was negotiated, China had about 300 to 400 weapons. So as a result, the New START force size at the time, which is what our modernization program is based on, was more than enough to deter Russia and China. So hence we considered China rather, this lesser included case. But due to China's nuclear buildup, and if they stay on their current trajectory, the US won't be able to treat China as a lesser included case in the future. So as a result, the US is now in a position where it must reevaluate the size and the composition of the US nuclear force that would be adequate to fulfill the long-standing roles of that force: deterrence, extended deterrence, and achieving objectives should deterrence fail, and hedging against adverse events. So China has said that it aims to have a world-class military capable of fighting and winning wars against any adversary by 2050. Our recommendations and findings focused on future conventional imbalances as well. And thus, we recommended that the U.S. increase its conventional forces, particularly in a few areas. So the U.S. needs more tankers, more surface ships, more hypersonic capabilities, and other prompt conventional strike, as well as more autonomous vehicles. We concluded that the U.S. and its allies and partners must be capable of deterring two simultaneous conventional conflicts in order to be able to deter a nuclear conflict, because at the end of the day, that's the goal. While still low, the probability of military conflict with either China or Russia, or both, is growing, and we need to be prepared. Unlike World War I and II, a major power conflict in the 21st century has the potential to escalate into a large-scale nuclear war. In other words, we must credibly convince any adversary that the cost of achieving its goals militarily will exceed the value. Hence, we need a deterrent force to prevent war from the beginning. Fundamentally, the Commission found that although it is holding the US-led international order is under attack from China and Russia and their authoritarian regimes, both of which seek to disrupt and displace this order and create a new version conducive to their authoritarian regimes, premised on values antithetical to those held by the US and like-minded allies. China's expanding conventional capabilities, and both Russia and China's expanding and diversifying nuclear capabilities could lead to a situation where both powers pose an existential threat to the US and its allies. Of course, it's challenging and it's expensive to maintain a strategic posture of nuclear and conventional systems sufficient to prevent major war, but it would be far more expensive to fight such a war. The Commission concluded that the very real prospect of regional aggression by nuclear-armed adversaries against the U.S. and its allies and partners now threaten U.S. vital interests and strategic stability in a way that we haven't seen in the last 20 years. Moreover, the U.S. faces a fundamentally different strategic setting than any it has experienced during the past 70 years. And we found that the coming years will be a decisive decade during which the U.S. must simultaneously deter two nuclear-armed adversaries. U.S. defense strategy to address this two-peer threat requires a U.S. nuclear force that is either larger in size, different in composition, or both. And therefore, decisions must be made now to meet these evolving deterrence requirements. So 2 points here. The first is that the Commission is not advocating a new nuclear arms race. And second, the Commission found that an expanded conventional force is essential to deter war. And without increased and modernized conventional forces, the U.S. will actually be forced to rely more on nuclear forces, not less. And so even though I've talked a lot about nuclear systems tonight, one of the major focuses of the report was that we need additional conventional capabilities so that we can prevent war in the first place. Again, China, because China had about 300 nuclear weapons at the time of the New START Treaty and did not have a triad, the New START force structure was sufficient for Russia, and we didn't need additional weapons to deter China. But Russia and China's aggressive military and foreign policies, the Chinese military modernization, including its nuclear expansion, as well as a possibility of military conflict with Russia or China, it simply wasn't even foreseen in 2010. And the most pressing threat then, and since 2001, really was to prevent nuclear nonproliferation and nuclear terrorism. A primary goal then was to reduce the role of nuclear weapons while maintaining strategic deterrence and stability. Moreover, Russia was seen as a potential partner, not an adversary, and China wasn't even on the radar screen. But by 2021, however, the changes in Russia and Chinese policy and force structure were becoming clear and recognized. And so in 2022, the Biden administration determined that China had replaced Russia as the pacing threat for conventional force planning, and Russia, of course, then ignored its commitments under the '94 Budapest Memorandum and launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So our report has 8 chapters, but the first chapter is the stakes. And the stakes really sets out why is all of this important and why should you care? So in the aftermath of World War II, the United States and its allies and partners built a geopolitical framework that fostered new levels of peace, prosperity, and freedom across the globe. U.S. and allied political, economic, and military strength underpin that system. In Asia and Europe, U.S. military capabilities continue to be central to assuring and protecting allies and partners and deterring adversaries. The U.S. now extends nuclear deterrence, in other words, its nuclear umbrella, to more than 30 treaty allies. And in so doing, nuclear deterrence assures that these allies remain non-nuclear and that they do not need their own nuclear weapons, thereby supporting larger and broader nonproliferation goals. Today, the long-standing U.S.-led international order is threatened by Chinese and Russian authoritarian regimes. These regimes seek to disrupt and displace this system and to create a new version that is premised on values antithetical to those held by the United States and like-minded allies and partners. China and Russia are pursuing strategies to dominate their neighbors and replace the status quo with an autocratic model. As a result, in their pursuit of global power, they coerce, threaten, interfere, disrupt, and provoke the U.S. and its allies and partners. China and Russia continue to act aggressively across diplomatic, informational, military, and economic fronts to undermine the actions of the United States and its allies and partners and the international orders. These actions threaten U.S. vital interests. So the Commission concluded that the U.S. must maintain its leadership on the global stage to revitalize and defend these systems. So I want to close with one thing. In the September-October edition of Foreign Affairs magazine, Condoleezza Rice wrote an article titled "The Perils of Isolationism. The World Still Needs America, and America Still Needs the World." And I just want to read her closing comments. And she said, "If the 19th and early 20th centuries taught Americans anything, it is this. Other great powers don't mind their own business. Instead, they seek to shape the global order. The future will be determined by the alliance of democratic free market states, or it will be determined by the revisionist powers harking back to a day of territorial conquest abroad and authoritarian practices at home. There is simply no other option." So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
How long did this whole thing take?
On that uplifting note, right?
How long did you say that this?
At the commission? About 18 months.
About 18 months.
Yeah.
Awesome. So let's go to question and answer, and I will turn the microphone over to Madelyn.
And just wait for the microphone if you
go.
have any questions, and I'll bring it to you.
Great, Justin, thanks.
I'm curious, especially when it comes to conventional weapons, what is our capabilities within the United States to build conventional weapons, and how dependent are we on foreign countries for that?
So this is a substantial problem right now. The U.S. defense industrial base doesn't have the capability that it had even 20 years ago. So rebuilding that conventional industrial base is really important. And we've even seen it, some of the weaknesses we've even seen as a result of sending various armaments and ammunition to Ukraine, is that the industrial base is actually having trouble keeping up with what we've sent to Ukraine. So part of our recommendation was to reinvigorate the conventional industrial base so that we have the ability to build more of what we need if we're really looking at a two-theater conflict. And one of the things we need most is tankers. We don't have anywhere near enough tankers, but there are a lot of things that we're short of.
Thank you. So after the weeks past of events and your talk tonight, I really feel good about things.
So I can only say this is why I'm a real joy at cocktail parties.
Did the study that you presented to Congress, did it offer the Armageddon scenario? First question. Second, we're now looking at events in the Middle East and Ukraine, and I just came back from 3 years in Turkey, so I see this firsthand. What is your prognosis on those events?
So let me go back. Let me go to the first part of that, which is really the commission. The commission believed we are most vulnerable from a conventional conflict with either Russia or China, either in sort of the European theater or the Asia-Pacific theater. And the whole goal of what the commission recommended and why there's a lot of emphasis in this report on having increased conventional capabilities is that we wanted the U.S. and its allies and partners, and they all clearly have to step up here too, to make sure there is adequate conventional capability to deter any regional war to begin with. Because it's in this regional war that we thought that the prospect of nuclear use is the highest. So we never thought that there's a very large probability. In fact, we think it's a very small probability of any sort of a very large scale nuclear conflict. But where we do think there is a potential, and some of Russia's recent nuclear saber rattling even hinted that, is that there may be an increased likelihood of nuclear use, small nuclear use, a few nuclear weapons in a regional conflict. And what we wanted to do is make sure that there's sufficient conventional capability to prevent the war to begin with, so that there's no nuclear use. So we tried really hard to avoid an Armageddon scenario. That's why there's so much emphasis on conventional. The Middle East. The Middle East is not really my area of expertise, to say the least. But again, you just worry that a prolonged conventional conflict could lead to some nuclear use for some reason. And maybe it's Russia, I don't know. But that's the biggest worry, is that we can continue to prevent large-scale conventional wars so that we don't have to go nuclear, and so nobody has to go nuclear. There was a question down here.
I'm on my way to the next question. Okay. By the way, our next program is December 5th, and back to our regular Thursday night programs. And also, we're an all-volunteer organization, and the city of Savannah is providing this facility for us, but we need to take out our own trash when you take your cups out and put them out at the end. So the all-volunteer board does not have to do it following the meeting. Thank you.
Were you surprised at in Ukraine that the Russians just didn't go in like a 7-day war and clean up and end a conversation that has gone on so long?
Yes, I think everybody was surprised. Although I think Russia may have been the most surprised because I think they thought that was what they were going to be successful at. The fact that the Ukrainian people, even though they have a long history of closeness with the Russians, the fact that they wanted to be an independent country and they wanted to protect their sovereign territory was very important, and I think a surprise.
Yes, I have a question. You mentioned that the Commission's not recommending going into another arms race, but how do we build a credible deterrence, particularly with arms control falling to the wayside, without starting another arms race?
Well, that's the question. And it's why there's been a lot of discussion in this administration on the Hill about what do we do when the New START treaty expires in 2026. And so, and of course, we have no history of any sort of an arms control with China, and they have no interest to enter into any sort of an arms control arrangement. So so we continue to hope. We hope maybe that even Russia, in the same way that they had agreed when the START 1 treaty expired, to continue to abide by it, even though the treaty was no longer in force. So we hope that maybe there will be an opportunity for discussions with Russia to have both sides agree to stay in the limits, the strategic limits, even after the New START treaty expires, and so that maybe there won't be a new arms race. We don't want it. It's ridiculously expensive, and there's no way you want to go back to that chart I started with that great big peak of 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I think you told us when this report was submitted by the Commission to Congress, but I don't recall the date. That's number one. And number two, what do you expect Congress will do with the report, and when do you hope to get a response from Congress?
So we made our recommendations to both the President and to Congress, and interestingly enough, the Biden administration has just recently updated its nuclear employment guidance, and they have made it clear that they are actually moving in a direction that's in concert with what we recommended. So they're looking at how to be able to deter the conventional conflicts simultaneously in two theaters. And that was not something that was recognized as a policy several years ago, was that we had to be prepared to do this simultaneous deterrence. And just lately, they have now recognized that this is something they have to be prepared for. And on the Congress front, in the NDAA, the National Defense Authorization Act, that's currently being considered by Congress, they have an entire section that implements various aspects of the Commission report. And we released our report in October of 2023, so just a little over a year ago.
With the potential threat from Iran, do you think the nuclear umbrella will be extended over the Arabian Peninsula, with the notable exception of Yemen, of course?
So, sorry, I don't think I understood. So the nuclear umbrella is already extended to South Korea. But if you could repeat that again. Sorry, I don't think I didn't hear it all. You cut out.
Yeah, my question was, with the potential threat from Iran, do you think eventually the nuclear umbrella will be extended over the Arabian Peninsula?
Oh, okay.
With the notable exception of Yemen, of course?
I don't think so, because it would require a treaty. So the allies that live under this nuclear umbrella are all allies with which we have a treaty, under which this umbrella is extended. One behind you.
On my way, David.
What provisions are in place to deal with an accident so that it does not escalate and become a worldwide issue?
An accident, a nuclear accident?
Right. Someone pushes the wrong button.
Okay, so it's not.
Or is a wacko and.
Yeah, okay. So in the U.S., there's a very extensive nuclear command and control system. that is designed to make sure that there is not only not an accident, but there's also no unauthorized launch. And it involves the White House, of course, but it also involves all of the National Command Center. It involves the chairman of the Joint Staff. It involves the commander of the U.S. Strategic Command. And interestingly enough, it also involves the Department of Energy, because the Department of Energy is the one who makes the warheads and understands what some of these capabilities are. So, I mean, obviously this whole system is very classified, but it is a very rigorous system that the whole purpose of which is to prevent unauthorized or accidental launch. So sometimes it's referred to as always never. So never when you don't want it, but always when you want it.
That's on our side, but what about others?
Yeah, well.
What about the hotlines that are supposed
Yeah.
to enable people to talk to one another and prevent escalation?
So for quite a while, there was a pretty effective hotline communication back and forth with Russia. There are still contacts with Russia, less so in China. We have a lot of concerns about North Korean nuclear weapons, to say the least, and how safe and secure they are. Although they probably are under very rigorous control of Kim Jong-un. But their safety and their inherent security, it's a big question. And we just don't know a lot about them, about the North Korean weapons.
Thank you again for your comments tonight. Could you give us your assessment of the political will in the United States and with our allies to accomplish the recommendations that you've put forward?
Yeah, so one of our recommendations, for a couple reasons. One is all of this is sort of new. It's not the environment that anybody wanted, and it's certainly not an environment that we were prepared for. But it's here, and so that's why I said at one point the report is very eye-opening, but it's troublesome because it's not what we wanted, it's not what we planned for, and certainly at the end of the Cold War when we started all these reductions in nuclear security, it's not where we thought we were going to go. So you hope that somewhere along the line we get back to the negotiating table, that China sees incentive to come back, that Russia sees incentive to come back, and that at some point we can again get back to a situation where we have either bilateral, trilateral, or international arms control. I hope it happens. And a lot of the things that we also talked about were how do members of Congress, how do other elected officials, how do executive branch officials, how do we talk about this? I mean, this is not something that most people either care about or interested in, or when you talk about it, they tend to just sort of glaze over. But it's important because getting this message out is one of our recommendations. Is people need to just talk about this stuff. It's not pleasant, but we need to be aware. One thing that was very instructive to the commission when we went through this process, in our briefings with the intelligence community, they would often say that they were wrong frequently about China. And what I mean by that is they would say, and I'll just make something up here, they'd say, well, they would guess that China would do, 4 things in 3 years. And most of the time, China was able to do 5 things in 2 years. And so the pace at which China has been increasing both its conventional and its nuclear weapons is really pretty dramatic.
Hi everybody, my name is Cohen from Singapore. I think just want to address that. Thank you very much for your hospitality. I'm actually visiting from Singapore and I'm enjoying Savannah. You have a beautiful city. Just addressing the elephant in the room, you might be thinking I'm from China. I'm not from China. I'm the most Chinese-looking person in the room, but I'm from Singapore. I'm extremely concerned about the situation with regards to China as well, because it's right in my backyard in Asia. A bit out of topic, but I just want to hear your personal opinion about the situation with Taiwan. Would China actually launch an offensive against Taiwan, especially with the precedents being set recently with Russia and Ukraine. I'm extremely concerned about that because Singapore is a very small country. I welcome every one of you to visit Singapore if you haven't. It's a very small country. We are a modern economy, but at the same time, we are very export driven. So any war would cripple our economy. So I'm extremely concerned about the situation in my backyard.
Yeah, and Taiwan is obviously a potential area of conflict, and so one of the primary goal here is to prevent conflict over Taiwan with China. So having these discussions again, figuring out how do we lessen the tensions on both sides is really important. And it's how does China So I mentioned that we have this order, and both China and Russia are really trying to disrupt it and reshape it in ways that are much more conducive and supportive to authoritarian regimes, not supporting human rights and that sort of thing. So some of this is having discussions. What are those things that you can do to convince China not to attack Taiwan? And then the second big piece of this is obviously one of the strengths of the U.S. That Russia and China don't enjoy is we have allies. We have very close allies, and our network of allies makes us stronger. And it also then in turn reinforces our allies. So making sure that we keep this network of allies in place and that our allies also step up and are strong as well, that is also a very good mechanism to prevent conflict in either region. And in many respects, it's what Condoleezza Rice said in her report. I mean, we have to recognize that we as free and democratic nations have an obligation to stick together and try to prevent conflict. I wish I had a better answer. But.
Hello, does it work? Okay. I was wondering, what were some of the most contentious issues that you and other members of the commission had? Like the reason why you're so pessimistic about it, and what the process was like for compromising getting that report done?
Well, I'm not going to tell you what the most contentious issues were, because we adopted a phrase that you might recognize, right? Instead of what happens in Las Vegas stays in Las Vegas, we said what happens in the commission stays in the commission. But I can assure you we had many, many, many robust debates on a whole variety of issues. But early on, we adopted a process where we made sure that everybody had an opportunity to express their views, that we addressed all their views, that if anybody had any additional questions, so from the intelligence community or anywhere else, or they wanted somebody to come in to speak on a certain topic, that all happened. So that everybody, nobody was left out. Everybody had an opportunity, and then not only to express their views, but to bring in additional information. And we also adopted a process where when we resolved an issue, that issue was done. So you couldn't be 7 issues down the road and then come back to that issue unless something had happened in the world and we all agreed to do it. And that helped too. And then in reality, it was really the intelligence that backed everything up.
Thank you very much.
Well, I have one question. Before we conclude, I have one question, and that is not necessarily possibly a strategic level issue, but what we used to call the backpackable nuclear weapons. What kind of oversight, and did the Commission have any view on control and manufacture of them? So a long time ago, we were talking about this earlier. A long time ago, in that, actually, I may have this. Hold on a second. Okay. So a long time ago, when we were at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. had all kinds of nuclear weapons. They had these things Jim was referring to, these little backpack munitions. They had little artillery shells. I mean, just everything under the sun. And as this chart, so on the left, the red things are all of these different types of nuclear systems that were in the inventory at one time. And
And it just became clear that not only did we not need as many, but we didn't need all these types. There was a lot of concern about the security of them. There was a lot of concern about the safety of them. And so over time, they were phased out. So what this chart is really demonstrating is the red ones are all gone. The yellow ones are in the process of being phased out. And the green ones are what are the warheads that are going to be modernized and will carry us into the future. There are a couple more that are planned out to the right of 2030. But this chart really shows, we're not going to do that again. We're not going to have that wide variety of different systems, and we're going to have a few systems that are safe and secure and reliable, because there was a huge concern about the safety and security of those old weapons.
No, they were, and those of us who were in Europe at the time with those types of units know that we were always concerned about them and where they could end up if they weren't carefully controlled. So anyway, thank you so much. And this concludes our program with special thanks to Madelyn Creedon for her presentation this evening. Couple last comments. Our next meeting, as Justin said, will be right here on December 5th. One other comment, and that is we have a great decisions program. If you're not aware of it, please ask us about it. It is a terrific program that talks about 8 or 9, and it'll take place in the first couple months of next year, 8 or 9 issues that are discussed one at a time. And each one of the classes is preceded by a read ahead as well as a 30-minute video at the start of the class. And there's anywhere from a dozen to 15 folks in there discussing issues like this, or a little broader possibly. But it's another opportunity for us to engage in this type of thinking and discussion and debate that provides us the opportunity for ideas to take back to our neighbors and friends. So again, I think this concludes a terrific program. Thank you again, Madelyn. Great. And we'll see you on December 5th right here, and I'll be careful going home tonight. Thank you.